this story, finally, we have some good news. And what do I mean by good news? Well, the radical, the Islamist separatist, Linda Sarsour, who was so radical, even the Women's March booted her off in, I think, 2017 or 18, was found herself a little bit of hot water. She had been designated to speak about Middle Eastern and North African heritage to the employees of Geico, the second largest auto insurer in the country. And sure enough, it's not surprising. There was, as she was announced to be the guest speaker, there was a significant amount of backlash that developed. And Geico, to their credit, dismissed her, canceled the whole event. And at this point, you sort of say, well, how does this differ from other cancellations? Well, first of all, she was not being billed simply as a speaker about Palestinian activisms or radical, her radical agenda. She can have free speech to do that as much as she wants. You remember, let me remind you a little bit about who Linda Sarsour is. While she's had a lot of covers for her work about an organization about Arabic diversity and other things, the bottom line is that Linda Sarsour was not only co-chair of the Women's March and was dismissed from that because of how anti-Semitic and radical her ideas are, but she also is a prominent supporter of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And what is that? That's a movement that basically is seeking not only to boycott Israel, but economically destroy it. So to anyone who's talking about her being a peace activist, the mission of BDS is to destroy and end the state of Israel. She believes in a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that basically does away with Israel, and where a Palestinian majority of what she sees as the solution then would take over. Now, also, she's had a too numerous to count here quotations that demonstrate her anti-Semitism and disdain for the Jewish community and bigotry that she has. So she's the last person that should be talking about equality and inclusion and diversity. And just a few years ago, in 2017, in the summer, she gave a speech at the Islamic Society of North America in which she talked about Muslims needing a jihad in America. Yes, jihad in America, like they were doing in the Middle East, revolution after revolution, she compared it to. And she said that it was our duty as Muslims, and she said this is the largest Islamic organization in America, that it was our duty as Muslims to fight against Islamophobia and bigotry, and just like the revolutions. Now, she compared the Trump administration at that time to revolutions against ruthless Arab tyrants across the Middle East. Now, if that's not absurd, I don't know what is. And the absurdity of it is she also gave similar. It's not the first time that she did that. She did that, I believe, from the White House and elsewhere, as she was then dropped by the Bernie Sanders campaign, by the Biden campaign, and others because of her inability to have any introspection and understanding of how anti-Semitic her language is, how her discussions and conversation about Israel are purely anti-Semitic. It's one thing to talk about disagreeing about policies within Israel. It's another to basically help lead a movement that wants to destroy it. So the bottom line is when you look back at Geico, I think it's a really important moment to talk about what do we mean by cancel culture. Cancel cultures in which things that somebody might have said 30 years ago, 20 years ago, in which they have since dismissed and since changed, since reformed, then cause them to be canceled for no reason. Or they're speaking to universities about their own ideology that they're actually explaining, that they have owned it, and they're talking about the movement, the platforms that they have, versus somebody who might be supposedly under the air of diversity. Remember, she's speaking about North African and Middle Eastern heritage, which includes the Christian Arabic community, which are a majority of Arabs in America. By the way, over 70% of American Arabs are of Christian religion, of the Christian faith. Jewish faith includes a number of the American Arabs, and also then a minority are the Muslim community. And then also she's talking about Muslim culture for the remainder of the Arabic population. And that culture is about food, music, ethnicity, diversity, language, history. Sure, it includes the Palestinian community, but somebody who basically is on the lead agenda of Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups in America is hardly one to really objectively talk about American Muslim history, American Arab American history. And, you know, what's fascinating is look who's come to her defense. CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, then put a press release that said 60 organizations have come to her defense. And other than one sort of outlying far leftist extreme Jewish organization that seems to side with the Muslim Brotherhood groups, the rest were simply a who's who in Islamist Muslim Brotherhood legacy organizations. And sure enough, Qatari media, Middle East Eye, which is a Islamist sympathizing network that tries to cater to English-speaking Arab diaspora, if you will, their headline said, Geico drops Linda Sarsour as a diversity speaker after outrage from pro-Israel groups. Oh, pro-Israel groups. No, it was from groups that are set to fight anti-Semitism, groups that believe in diversity and equity, groups that understand the difference between hate, radicalism, and actual simply policy and ideological diversity. And this is the issue with Islamists. The who's who of organizations that included the Islamic Circle of North America, the Islamic Society of North America, Council on American Islamic Relations, etc., were basically organizations that are part of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy group. Muslim Brotherhood are Islamists that, when it comes to American ideas, liberalism, are separatists. They don't adhere to a belief that the ideal system of governance is a secular liberal society, but rather they see themselves as a minority here who follow the laws of the land, but do not believe if Muslims are a majority, it should remain that way, but simply become an Islamic state, as we saw with the Muslim Brotherhood, what they did in Egypt and what they're trying to do around the world. So if you look at the letter that was signed by CARE, it basically says, quote, after Geico announced that Sarsour was scheduled to speak at an event celebrating Middle Eastern North African history, anti-Palestinian and anti-Muslim organizations attacked both Sarsour and the company, which then canceled the entire event and accused Sarsour of practicing hate and exclusion. In a joint statement of 60 civil and human rights organizations, 60 civil. One or two of them were basically non-Muslim, and the rest were Islamist Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups that include either Arab Islamist groups or Deobandi type Indo-Pakistani Islamist groups. They said, we strongly condemn Geico for bowing down to the anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian hate groups, canceling an event meant to celebrate National Arab American Heritage Month, and smearing one of our nation's most prominent and impactful activists. Oh, really? Smearing? They simply repeated what she said. She called for a jihad in America. And if you look, I'll tell you, as somebody, as somebody who loves my faith and is dedicated to the reform against political Islam and the Islamic State concept, Linda Sarsour epitomizes she checks every box of how our communities are radicalized across the country. Their jihadization of the ideas, where she called for jihad and she says, it was nonviolent jihad. But basically, she compared it to the violent revolutions in the Middle East against tyrants, against those who truly deserved Syria, Libya, Egypt, truly deserved a civil war because of how much oppression and repression existed and how little freedoms they had to express themselves and what kind of open-air prisons they lived in and continue to live in. But you compare that to the country that is her nation, America, with our Constitution. She called for a jihad. She has no insight into what the BDS movement is, she does, but she tries to dissimulate it and pretend it's a peaceful ideological battle when in fact it's an organization focused on the economic destruction of Israel. And her commentary about what happens in Israel and her commentary about the Jewish community is truly anti-Semitic. And these letters, the support from the Islamist group proves that it's not about diversity. It was about her developing or trying to reshape her platform, as when she was running the Women's March, even the Women's March that included folks from the Black Lives Matter movement that had supported the radical anti-Semitism of Louis Farrakhan that she never criticized. So if you want a clinic in anti-Semitism, look at the radical ideas pushed by the likes of the supporters of the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan. And Linda Sarsour supported that and has never condemned it and never come out on record as separating herself from the ideas and the anti-Semitism of the Nation of Islam. So, for once, I wouldn't even call this under cancel culture. I think that what happened to Linda Sarsour being canceled by Geico is an example of how companies can right themselves. Companies can, through negligence and incompetence, pick the wrong people to speak and realize, oh my God, when they did a Google search, how could we brand Geico with the brand of a activist who is a separatist, who is an Islamist, who is an anti-Semite, who is a jihadist, and who has pushed the margins of appropriateness to the point of radicalization in which her ideas might be reported to be nonviolent, but when it comes down to it, are ideas that will begin to push the American Muslim and Arabic community down the pathway of radicalization. So thank you, Geico, for waking up. I'm sorry you had to have the incompetence that caused this kerfuffle, but the kerfuffle between Sarsour and Geico, I think, is very educational about how companies can once in a while get it right. And no, it is actually bigoted to the Muslim community to think that people like Linda Sarsour should be speaking for our community. It is bigoted to think that we can't find more objective, rational voices from within our community who can talk about being Arabic, can talk about being Muslim, Christian, Jewish, without invoking conspiracy theories and invoking a hatred towards a minority like the Jewish community, without invoking a supremacism like they do in the support of groups like Hamas. The Islamist media and Middle East Eye and others talked about her being a Palestinian who was discriminated because she was kicked out from doing this education. But her Palestinian activism isn't about her Palestinian culture. No, it is about her support of the BDS movement. Remember when she went with Ilhan Omar to Israel, they were, I think, well, actually it wasn't her, it was Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, but they were initially detained because the BDS movement is not a necessarily peaceful movement that wants to peacefully see Israel change. It wants every country to strangulate its economy. And they never recognize the wonderful things that come out of Israel with cancer research and the largest number of startups of any country on the planet when it comes to technology and other new technologies. So, Geico, thank you for getting it right. Thank you for remembering that the American Muslim community, the American Arab community is not monolithic, that we are truly diverse, and thank you for not letting Islamists indoctrinate your employees into believing that we are all face first Islamists and that everyone else isn't. Remember, the Linda Sarsours of the world like to say that the Muslim reform movement leaders are not real Muslims, that they're somehow marginal, too liberal. And isn't that bizarre that these so-called feminists think we're the liberal ones, when in fact they're the ones that use identity politics to exploit the conversation about political Islam?